The air was thick with the stench of burnt ozone as Commissar Wren's boot crunched on the charred remnants of the dead beneath him. The once thriving underhive of Hive Veros had fallen silent, a grim echo of the violence that had filled the air just hours before. It had been the uprising that had led them here, to this forsaken sanctum buried deep within the bowels of Targos Prime, a planet now forgotten by most. Yet something more sinister stirred in the darkness of these forsaken tunnels. "We found something," the Vox operator muttered through the static of his transmitter, voice shaky but unmistakably tense. Wren's eyes narrowed as he studied the officer, noting the pale complexion of the man beneath his helmet. He didn't need to ask to know that whatever was found wasn't in the standard reports. The bones of the dead, once scattered across the sanctum in disarray, had been meticulously arranged. Wren stepped closer to the largest pile, no longer simply remains, but a horrifying testament to something far beyond the ordinary. The bones hadn't rotted, hadn't decomposed as they should have. They had been preserved. Every curve and twist of the skeletal remained smooth, untouched by time. "How long?" Wren's voice cut through the tension, sharp and authoritative. His question wasn't directed at any specific man, but to the very air itself. "How long has this been here?" "No record of anything like it, sir," the officer stammered, eyes wide with fear. "We've never seen corpses like this. The bones, they're still warm, not decomposing. There's something wrong." Wren clenched his fists, feeling the familiar tightness of dread creeping up his spine. He wasn't one to believe in superstition, but he knew a danger when he saw it. "Get a scan," he commanded, his voice unwavering. The officer quickly moved to comply, his hands shaking as he set the scanner in place. The device beeped faintly, and the readings began to filter through. But nothing in Wren's years of service had prepared him for what came next. The screen flickered and warped, the symbols and numbers shifting in ways that couldn't be explained by any known Imperial technology. The bones on the scan glowed with a faint resonance, a vibration that the machine couldn't seem to reconcile with reality. "What is this?" the officer asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Wren didn't answer immediately. His gaze flicked back to the bones, his eyes narrowing. He stepped forward, reaching for the nearest femur. The smooth surface of the bone felt cold beneath his gloved hand, despite the heat of the underground catacombs. It almost felt as if it was pulsing with life, a slow, rhythmic thrum against his fingertips. It was then that he heard it, faint at first, like the scratching of a distant insect, then louder, a repeated chanting rising from the depths of the sanctum. His heart skipped a beat. The words were incomprehensible at first, but Wren knew they weren't Imperial. These were no prayers of the Emperor or chants of the ecclesiarchy. These were something else, something far older and far more dangerous. The chanting grew louder, more insistent, and Wren's jaw tightened. "Move out," he barked, forcing the men into position, eyes scanning the dim passageways that stretched ahead of them. But as the regiment moved forward, the walls seemed to close in, and the faint echoes of the chanting became overwhelming. The air grew heavier with every step, each breath a little harder to take as the atmosphere thickened with an unnatural humidity. The very bones in the walls seemed to hum, their cracks filled with something that moved behind them. Something alive. A hiss of static broke through the comms, sharp and grating. "Commissar, we've got a problem!" the Vox operator shouted over the line, his voice cracking. Wren's grip tightened on his bolt pistol, but he didn't turn. "What is it?" It's them," the officer stammered, almost in disbelief. "The bones! They're moving!" Wren's heart skipped as a low growl echoed from the darkness ahead. "Everyone, form up!" His command rang out sharply, though he felt the weight of uncertainty pressing in on him. This was no uprising, no insurrection of the common man. This was something far older, far darker, and far more insidious than anything he could have prepared for. As the men tightened their formation, Ren's eyes scanned the shadows once more. His mind raced with calculations, tactical decisions that were slowly becoming irrelevant in the face of this new horror. The bones, those perfect relics of the dead, were more than just relics of the past. They were alive, and they were watching. A pulse of energy radiated from the walls, and Ren felt it, a ripple in the very air itself. The bones were speaking, but not in any language he knew. The air around them hummed with power, and the walls seemed to shift, closing them in. The familiar shape of the tunnels twisted and turned, transforming into a labyrinth of bone, each turn an impossible curve that led deeper into the heart of the unknown. "We need to get out of here," the Vox operator whispered, his eyes wide with fear. Ren didn't respond immediately. His eyes were locked on the entrance to the next chamber, where an unearthly light flickered, casting strange shadows on the walls. It was a soft, pale glow, almost inviting. And yet, something deep within him knew it wasn't an invitation. It was a trap, a promise of something far worse waiting for them within. "Keep moving!" Ren barked, his voice snapping with urgency. He didn't know how much time they had before the next wave of the bone cult would claim them all. The chanting swelled to a deafening crescendo, and for a fleeting moment, Ren thought he could hear the words. "The bones remember." A strange chill ran through him, and for the first time in his long career, he understood the true meaning of the word fear. The low thrum of the pulse still reverberated in the air as Commissar Ren's boots echoed against the bone-laden walls, the crunch of every step underscoring the quiet unease that had settled over the regiment. The passageway ahead twisted unnaturally, the walls narrowing as if the very catacombs themselves were shifting to entrap them. The air was thick, laden with the stench of something decayed yet oddly alive. Ren's throat tightened, his breath coming in short, sharp bursts as he forced his thoughts away from the gnawing dread that clung to the edges of his mind. The rest of the men moved in tight formation, rifles held close, eyes darting nervously. Even the hardened veterans of the 132nd Vostroyan, who had fought across countless worlds, seemed unnerved by the whispering bones and the strange energy that permeated the space. They weren't afraid of the enemy, not really, but they had never faced anything like this before. "Commissar!" The Vox operator's voice crackled through the comms, sharp with static. "We're not alone in here. I can feel them watching us." Ren didn't reply immediately. His mind raced as the temperature in the air seemed to drop, the humidity thickening with each passing moment. The shadows on the walls shifted unnaturally, elongating as if the bones themselves were reaching, stretching toward them. He glanced over his shoulder briefly, making sure the rear was secure before pushing forward. The men were nervous, and Ren could feel it, like a sickness infecting them, crawling beneath their skin. It was more than fear. It was a primal terror. They moved deeper into the labyrinth, the floor now slick with a strange, slick substance that clung to their boots like tar. The walls had changed. No longer simple bone, they were fused together in intricate, impossible patterns, etched with symbols Ren couldn't recognize. Some resembled religious sigils, others patterns too complex to make sense of. But they all seemed to pulse, faintly, in the dim light of their torches. "Report!" Ren barked, his voice sharp as he snapped his attention back to the men around him. "Nothing yet, sir," one of the sergeants called out from the front. His voice was steady, but Ren saw the beads of sweat on his brow, glistening in the flickering light. Just the same damn bone and the whispers. Ren clenched his jaw. The whispers had been growing louder ever since they entered the tunnels. At first, they'd been soft, distant, like a faint hum at the edge of his hearing. But now, it was as if they were inside his skull, scratching against his mind. He could almost make out words, almost, but they were indecipherable, foreign, and yet chillingly familiar at the same time. They reached a junction where 3 corridors stretched off into the darkness. Ren didn't hesitate. "Take the left," he ordered, his voice calm but firm. It was a decision born of instinct, of knowing that whatever this place was, it was not a structure meant for human feet. They turned left, moving deeper into the heart of the labyrinth. The air grew heavier, the walls closing in further. They'd been walking for hours, but time seemed to blur in the unrelenting dark. The sound of their footsteps felt like an intrusion, each step too loud, too heavy against the silence that surrounded them. Then, just as Ren's frustration was beginning to mount, the passage opened into a vast chamber. It was like no chamber he had ever seen. A sea of bones stretched out before him, stacked in impossible formations, as if an entire world had been reduced to its skeletal remains and then rebuilt into this nightmarish structure. At the center of the chamber stood a massive altar, its surface covered in arcane symbols, dark runes that seemed to writhe in the dim light. The bones here were different. They were not the remains of men, but something other, larger, more ancient. The chanting intensified, now clear and unrelenting, each syllable striking with an unnatural resonance. Ren's hand gripped the hilt of his power sword, his instincts flaring. "Hold formation," he growled, keeping his voice low but filled with authority. The men around him were tense, weapons at the ready, their eyes darting nervously. They all felt it, the wrongness of this place. From within the shadows of the chamber, a figure emerged. A tall silhouette, draped in tattered robes, its face hidden beneath a mask made of bone. The figure moved with an eerie grace, its steps soundless on the bone-laden ground. As it drew closer, Ren's eyes narrowed, and he could feel his pulse quicken. The figure stopped before the altar, its outstretched arms raised as if to conduct some unseen ritual. Ren's thoughts raced. The bone cult. This was them, the ones who had been hiding in the shadows of the Imperium, growing in power, waiting. This was what they had come to find, and now it was clear. It was no simple cult. It was something far more ancient, something tied to the very fabric of the Imperium's history, its foundations. The masked figure spoke, the voice distorted, reverberating as if it came from deep within the bones themselves. "You dare to tread upon the sacred ground of the bones," it intoned, the words echoing in Ren's mind. "You, who have forgotten the ancient oaths, the bones remember." Ren's grip tightened on his weapon. This was no time for hesitation. With a sharp command, he ordered the regiment to advance, but the moment they stepped forward, the ground beneath their feet shifted. The bones moved, as if alive, rising from the earth to form barriers, blocking their path. The chamber trembled, and the whispers grew louder, more insistent. And then, in the middle of the chaos, Ren realized the truth. The bones weren't just relics, they were alive, and they were not done with them yet. The figure at the altar laughed, a dry, hollow sound that seemed to echo across the chamber. "You will be the first of many," it said, its voice carrying the weight of centuries. "The bones will rise again." Ren didn't have time to process the full implications of the figure's words. He only knew that they had to move, and fast. The labyrinth was alive with the sound of shifting bone, and they were at its mercy. He ordered the men forward, but the walls of bone were closing in, the floor buckling beneath them. The regiment pressed on, fighting against the unnatural forces that sought to tear them apart. But in the back of his mind, Ren could hear the whispers growing louder, calling to him. They were all part of it now, part of the curse, and there was no way out. The air grew colder with every step, and Ren could feel the oppressive weight of the labyrinth pressing down on him, as though the very walls were alive. The chanting was now a constant presence in his mind, a pulsing rhythm that seemed to mirror his own heartbeat. It came from all directions, no longer just an echo of distant voices, but a tangible, almost physical presence that surrounded them. The air tasted of rust and decay, thick with the smell of old blood and something far older, something that felt like death itself. The bone structures surrounding them seemed to hum, vibrating in unison with the rhythm of the chant. "Hold your line," Ren commanded, his voice hoarse but firm. He glanced over his shoulder to see his men struggling to keep their composure. The shadows were closing in around them, warping the walls into impossible angles, like the very fabric of reality was stretching and twisting. The regiment had crossed into something far beyond their understanding, and every instinct screamed at him to turn back. But there was no turning back now. The Vox had gone dead, static filling the comms with only fragmented words, distorted sounds. It was as though the very frequencies were being consumed by the dark. No word from the rest of the battalion, no answer from the ship in orbit. It was just them, alone, in the dark. The figure that had spoken before, the one with the mask of bone, was nowhere to be seen. But Ren could feel its presence, lurking in the shadows, watching them. The whispering of the bones intensified, their voices clawing at his mind, pulling him toward them. He gripped his power sword tighter, the hilt cutting into his gloved hand, trying to focus his thoughts. They had to keep moving. As they advanced, the bone formations seemed to grow more intricate, more deliberate. The walls no longer appeared natural, but rather had been crafted, shaped into intricate designs, as if they were part of some vast and ancient structure. The floors, too, were becoming more unstable, each step sinking slightly into the soft, slick substance beneath them. The scent of decay grew stronger, suffocating, and Ren fought the urge to gag. The deeper they went, the more disorienting it became. The sounds of footsteps were muffled, swallowed by the heavy silence that pressed in, from all sides. It was as though the very place had been designed to trap them, to erase all traces of their presence from the world. No echoes, no signals, just them, marching deeper into the heart of the curse. Then came the first sound, a soft click, like the sound of bone against bone, followed by a low growl, too deep to be human. The men tensed, weapons raised, scanning the dark. Nothing moved, but the air seemed to pulse with something sinister, something that could not be seen, only felt. "Keep moving," Ren ordered again, his voice strained but steady. But the fear was there, unmistakable, hanging thick in the air like a heavy fog. Every man could feel it. They were being hunted. Suddenly, a series of sharp cracks rang out, followed by the unmistakable sound of bones shifting. The walls of the labyrinth seemed to shift once again, the passages closing in on them. It was a trap. No, it had always been a trap. Ren snapped into action, barking orders, but before he could even raise his weapon, the floor beneath them erupted. Bone spikes shot up from the ground, sharp and jagged, their white edges glowing faintly in the dark. One of the men screamed as the spike pierced through his chest, the sound of cracking bones filling the chamber. Another tried to pull him free, but the spike was already retracting, dragging the soldier back into the floor. The man's screams echoed, then were abruptly cut off. The regiment was in chaos. Men fired blindly into the dark, their lasguns sizzling as they cut through the air. But nothing could stop it. The bones were alive. The very ground beneath them was alive, shifting and contorting with purpose. "Fall back!" Ren shouted, but there was no way to retreat. The passages behind them were blocked by shifting walls of bone. It was as though the labyrinth had no end, no beginning, just a continuous spiral of madness. The walls were closing in, trapping them in a tomb from which there was no escape. Ren's mind raced. They couldn't fight the bones. Not like this. They were not just enemies of flesh. They were something older, something beyond. He glanced around desperately for a solution, but there was none. This place didn't follow the rules of reality. It existed outside the Emperor's light. And for the first time, Ren understood that they were no longer just facing a cult. They were facing something ancient, something that had never died, only slumbered, waiting for the right moment to awaken. "Commissar, look!" a voice cried out, and Ren turned to see one of the sergeants pointing to the far end of the chamber, where a new shape had appeared, emerging from the shadows. It was the masked figure again, standing in front of the altar, its arms raised high, as it chanted in a tongue that seemed to bleed through Ren's mind, turning his thoughts into a whirl of dizziness. The figure was surrounded by an eerie light, pale and cold, as though the very air around it was being drained of life. "The bone cult," Ren whispered, his voice a mixture of awe and dread. "This is what they were after. This is what they've been calling." The figure's head turned, its gaze locking onto Ren with an intensity that made his blood run cold. And then, in that moment, everything changed. The walls of bone, the twisted labyrinth, they all fell silent. The whispering stopped. The chanting ceased. For a single impossible instant, there was only stillness. And then, without warning, the ground beneath them began to shake. It started as a low rumble, like thunder in the distance, but it quickly grew stronger, the very air vibrating with an unnatural force. The floor cracked open, and from the depths of the abyss, something began to rise. Something massive. Ren's heart slammed in his chest as he realized the truth. The labyrinth had been alive for centuries, waiting for this moment, for this ritual to be completed. And now, it was waking. The bone cult's true purpose was becoming clear. They were not just seeking power, they were resurrecting something far worse. Something that would destroy them all. "Move! Now!" Ren shouted, snapping his men into action. But it was too late. The ground was splitting apart, and the bones were rising from the earth, stretching to the sky. The labyrinth was alive, and it was hungry. The ground shook with an unnatural force, and Ren felt it in his bones, literally. The floor beneath him cracked open, sending bone shards and dust swirling through the air. His men scrambled to keep their footing, but the very earth seemed to be buckling, the walls of the labyrinth warping and contorting, like the flesh of some massive creature awakening from a long slumber. Every instinct screamed at him to run, but there was nowhere to run. The sound of grinding bone filled the air as the ancient labyrinth trembled. The air itself seemed to grow thick with power, crackling as if the very atmosphere was being twisted by some malevolent force. The altar before them, the one that had once been so still, so silent, began to hum, a low, almost imperceptible vibration that seemed to resonate with everything in the chamber. Ren could feel it deep in his chest, as if the vibrations were shaking his very soul. "Form up!" he barked, trying to rally the men. "We need to get out of here." But his voice barely carried above the chaos. The regiment had scattered, every man retreating into the darkness, but the ground kept shifting beneath them. The walls themselves seemed to close in, trapping them, blocking their path. It was as if the labyrinth had been designed for one purpose only, to keep them here, to trap them forever. Ren's breath came in ragged gasps as he fought to keep his bearings. The men were panicking. Some were firing blindly, others stumbling backward, their eyes wide with terror. He saw one of the sergeants fall to his knees, clutching his head, his screams mingling with the shrieking cacophony of the bones rising from the floor. His body convulsed, spasming as if the very marrow inside his bones was turning to liquid. It was a grotesque, horrifying sight, and Ren's stomach churned. "Hold it together!" Ren shouted, his voice cracking with desperation. He turned to see the other soldiers, the few who hadn't completely lost their composure. "We cannot let it win!" But even as he spoke, the very ground beneath them split open wider, and from the depths, something monstrous began to rise. It was not a single figure. No, it was more than that. It was a thing. A vast, shifting mass of bone and sinew, stretching impossibly high into the darkness, its shape constantly shifting, as though it were an amalgamation of countless bodies fused together over the ages. The air around it was thick with an otherworldly energy, radiating from the bones like some terrible beacon. Ren felt a chill grip his heart as he stared at it. This was no simple cult. This was no mundane force of nature. What they had awakened here, what they had trespassed upon, was something far older, something that had been waiting for millennia to return to the world. The creature, if one could even call it that, rose higher and higher, the bones grinding together with a sickening sound. The men fired their laser guns in desperation, but the beams barely scratched its surface. The creature's form rippled, as though the energy of the warp was pulling it in and out of existence, twisting and distorting with every passing moment. Ren's heart pounded in his chest, but he didn't have time to think. "Fall back! Fall back to the entrance!" he shouted, his voice cutting through the panic. He turned to face the direction they had come from, but the labyrinth had already shifted again. The walls had closed in tighter, and the passage they had used to enter was now a solid wall of bone, blocking their escape. "Damn it!" Ren cursed, slamming his fist against the wall. The labyrinth was alive, changing in response to their every move, trapping them deeper within its endless corridors. There was no escape. The creature, the thing, continued to rise, its form growing more defined with every passing second. The bones that composed it stretched and creaked, some twisting and reshaping, while others seemed to pull free from the very ground itself, joining the growing mass. Ren could hear the faint whispers again, this time louder, more insistent. The voices were coming from all around them now, filling the chamber, swirling in his mind. They're calling," one of the men gasped, his eyes wide with terror. "The bones, they're calling us, pulling us in." Ren gritted his teeth. There was no time for hesitation. If they didn't act now, they would be consumed. He turned to the nearest soldier, one of the few who hadn't completely lost their nerve. "We need to destroy it," he said, voice low and determined. "Burn it. Burn everything." The soldier nodded, his eyes flicking toward his weapon. But before he could react, the creature's massive form lurched forward, sending a shockwave of force through the air. Ren stumbled, losing his footing, but he quickly regained his balance. The creature's bones creaked and groaned as they shifted, forming tendrils that lashed out like whips, tearing through the air. A scream cut through the chaos as one of the men was struck by a tendril, his body crushed beneath the weight of the bones. It was clear now. The thing was not just a creature. It was a ritual, a cosmic summoning, an ancient force that had been waiting to return. And it was feeding off their fear, their desperation. Every scream, every gunshot, every step they took only made it stronger. "Now!" Ren shouted, urging the men to act. "We burn it. We burn it all." But before they could even raise their weapons, the ground shifted once more. The bones trembled, and the creature let out a guttural roar, one that vibrated through the very air. Its massive form began to expand, swallowing the light, pulling everything into the depths of its endless maw. "Get to the altar," Ren commanded, though he knew it was a futile effort. The altar was the source of the ritual. If they couldn't stop it, if they couldn't destroy it, the creature would consume them all. As they rushed toward the altar, the walls closed in around them, and the whispering of the bones grew louder, more desperate. They were closing in, and Ren could feel his own bones vibrating, the marrow inside him throbbing with the call. It was as if the creature had turned its gaze upon him, and he could feel it pulling at him, urging him to step closer to the altar, to join in the ritual. The darkness threatened to swallow him whole, and for a moment he wondered if he would ever escape this place alive. But there was no time for doubt, no time for hesitation. The fate of his men and the fate of the Imperium rested in their hands. Ren's boots slammed against the shifting floor as he sprinted toward the altar, every muscle in his body screaming with urgency. Behind him, the walls of bone groaned, their shifting forms tightening like a noose around them. The air was thick with the oppressive weight of ancient power, and each breath felt harder than the last, as though the very atmosphere was suffocating them. The men, those few who still had the strength to move, followed him. But there was no time. The ritual was already in motion, and the creature was feeding. The altar loomed ahead, massive and imposing, carved from the same unnatural bone as the rest of the labyrinth. Its surface pulsed with an eerie light, an otherworldly glow that reflected off the jagged edges, casting long, twisted shadows. It was here that the ritual had begun, and it was here that it would end, either in destruction or in total annihilation. Ren's breath came in sharp bursts as he reached the altar, his eyes fixed on the massive stone slab at its center. The air around it hummed with power, vibrating with the ancient energy that had been unleashed. But something was wrong. The altar wasn't just a symbol of the bone cult. It was a conduit, the very core of the labyrinth, a channel through which the dark energy flowed. "Commissar!" The sergeant's voice broke through the chaos, sharp with panic. It's feeding off us. The bones, they're alive." Ren didn't answer. He didn't have the luxury of time. The creature was feeding, yes, but not just on fear. It was feeding on them, on their very souls. He could feel it now too. This presence, this overwhelming, suffocating force that clawed at his mind. His thoughts, his will, they were slipping, like sand through his fingers. The creature's power was too great, and they were too small. He raised his power sword, its crackling blade lighting the immediate darkness, and slashed it through the air in a wide arc, cutting down the first wave of bone tendrils that lashed out from the altar. The creature shrieked, a deep, guttural sound that echoed in Ren's mind like a thunderclap. His grip on the hilt tightened as the weight of his desperation pressed down on him. They had to destroy the altar, sever the connection. There was no other way. The men fought beside him, hacking at the twisting bone formations that tried to entangle them. The walls were closing in faster now, and Ren could see the tendrils of bone, blackened and slick with some foul ichor, crawling along the floor toward them. The whispers were louder, more frantic, but now they had a rhythm to them, an almost musical quality that sent a cold shiver up his spine. It was as if the very sound of the bones was an invitation, an offer. "Come closer. Join us." Ren forced the thought away, raising his sword again to sever another tendril. His arms were burning with fatigue, his breath ragged and desperate. He had no choice but to push on. The creature was here, feeding, and it would not stop until they were consumed. The sergeant at his side was cutting through another group of tendrils, his laser spitting bright blue bolts of energy into the advancing mass of bone, but it was no use. The creature was simply too vast. Each time they cut one down, two more seemed to take its place, rising from the ground like some dark, twisted forest of death. "Commissar, we—" The sergeant's voice was drowned out by a scream from the far side of the altar. Ren turned just in time to see another soldier fall, his body yanked violently toward the altar. A tendril had wrapped around his neck, dragging him into the pulsing mass of bone. His screams were cut short as his body was crushed, his form twisted and contorted, as the bones around him tightened like a noose. "Fall back!" Ren shouted, but his voice was swallowed by the rising storm of bone and darkness. There was no retreat, only the altar and the insidious, corrupting force that fed from it. The bones beneath them shifted again, violently this time, as if some great weight had been thrown upon them. The altar's surface rippled, the sigils carved into it beginning to glow brighter, hotter, their light taking on a sickly green hue. Ren's stomach lurched as the power in the chamber surged. The whispers were now a deafening roar in his mind, and for a moment he lost himself in them, lost himself in the hunger. He could feel his bones vibrating, the marrow in his body aching in response, as though the creature was calling to him personally. The ritual had reached its peak. The creature, no, the force, was about to break free. Ren snapped back to reality with a jolt, fighting against the rising wave of madness that threatened to pull him under. He was not going to be consumed. Not like this. He looked at the altar again, its surface now pulsating in time with his heartbeat. The bone structure around it had begun to form a massive, twisting column of bone that reached up to the ceiling, a grotesque spire of death. And in the center, the heart of it all, the sigils began to shift and writhe like living things. It's not just a ritual, Ren realized with a sinking feeling. It's a gateway. The bone mass was a door, an entrance, and the creature on the other side had already begun to push through. "We can't let it open," Ren muttered, his voice low but firm, the weight of the truth settling over him like a heavy shroud. He turned to the remaining men, a last plea in his eyes. "Burn it. Burn everything." But the command felt hollow as soon as it left his mouth. They were too late. The power of the ritual had grown too strong. The creature would not be stopped by mere fire or steel. It was beyond that now. It had been feeding on the bones, on the souls of the men, on the marrow of the Imperium itself. Ren turned back to the altar, his grip tightening around the hilt of his sword. The ritual was complete. The doorway was open, and something terrible was coming through. His mind screamed at him to act, but there was nothing left to do. The bones were rising, and the creature was stepping through. Ren's eyes locked on the twisting column of bone that now dominated the chamber. It had grown, expanding toward the ceiling in a grotesque mockery of a living structure, a spire formed from the bones of those who had fallen. The whispers were no longer just in his mind. They filled the air, reverberating through the walls, growing louder with each passing second. He could feel the vibration in his bones, the very marrow thrumming with the call of something beyond. Something was coming. The altar at the base of the spire flickered with an unnatural light, the sigils glowing brighter, pulsing with each breath of the ritual. The bones themselves were bending to the will of the thing on the other side, and Ren understood now. The ritual hadn't been to summon power. No, it had been to tear a hole in reality, to breach the very fabric of the warp and bring whatever entity had been sealed away back into the world. The bone cult hadn't just been performing rituals. They had been praying to something that should never be prayed to. The air grew colder still, a biting frost that clung to his skin and seeped into his bones. Ren's breath came in sharp bursts, visible in the frigid air, but it was the only sign of life left. The rest of his men were frozen, either in awe or fear, their weapons lowered, their eyes glazed as they stared at the growing spire. He could see their minds unraveling, each man slipping into a kind of dazed stupor as the thing on the other side of the veil slowly began to breach through. He had to act, or they would all be lost. Ren's sword, still crackling with energy, felt heavy in his hand as he raised it again, this time not in attack, but in defiance. He screamed a single desperate command to his men, hoping that something, anything, would snap them back to the present, away from the madness that was spreading like poison through their minds. "Fight!" he bellowed, his voice hoarse but firm. "Fight for your lives." The words seemed to tear through the fog of their minds, and for a brief moment, Ren saw the spark of recognition in their eyes. The soldiers lifted their weapons, but they were slow, hesitant. The pull of the ritual, the weight of the creature pushing through, was too strong. But they couldn't stop now. There was no more time for hesitation. With a surge of energy, Ren rushed toward the altar, his power sword slashing through the bone tendrils that still reached toward him. The walls groaned, the structure of the labyrinth shifting again, as though the entire place was alive and trying to fight back. The bones beneath his feet cracked, the ground sinking under the weight of something enormous. The entity on the other side of the breach was almost here, and he could feel it in every fiber of his being. It was a hunger, a cold, endless hunger that could consume everything in its path. "We cannot let it through," he shouted, his voice breaking as he cleaved another bone tendril. "This is the Emperor's will. Stand and fight." But the creature, the dark thing beyond the veil, had already begun to make itself known. Its presence was like a shadow that swallowed the light, an oppressive weight that pressed down on Ren's chest. The air itself seemed to twist, as if the very space was warping under its power. It was no longer just a whisper. Now, the voice was clear, booming in his mind, scratching at the edges of his consciousness. "You are weak," the voice thundered, an ancient hollow sound that made Ren's knees buckle. You will all be consumed. The soldiers around him screamed, their voices high and terrified as they tried to hold their ground, but the bone tendrils were already grabbing hold of them. One man was yanked into the darkness, his screams echoing through the chamber as the bones wrapped around him, dragging him toward the growing spire. Ren's mind screamed in horror, but there was nothing he could do. There were too many. The creature was pulling them in, one by one. He turned back to the altar, his focus narrowing. The sigils that had once seemed like distant symbols of power were now alive, glowing with an otherworldly energy that rippled through the very air. They were the key. The ritual wasn't just about summoning the creature. It was about giving it entry, about binding it to this reality. Ren surged forward, ignoring the tendrils that lashed out at him. His mind raced. He had to stop the ritual. He didn't know how, but he had to destroy the altar. The power here was too great, too ancient. There was no other choice. With a cry of desperation, Ren plunged his sword into the heart of the altar. The bones screamed, an ear-splitting shriek that rattled his teeth and made his skin crawl. For a brief moment the world seemed to stop, frozen in time, as if the ritual itself was holding its breath. And then, the light of the altar flared brighter than the sun, blinding Ren. He pulled back, shielding his eyes, but the heat from the light seared through his armor, through his very flesh. The creature on the other side of the breach screamed, a horrible, hollow sound that echoed in his mind. The walls shook violently as the altar began to crack, its surface splintering under the force of the energy that was now surging through it. Ren could feel the very air ripping apart, the veil between worlds weakening, and in that moment, he knew they weren't just fighting for their lives anymore. They were fighting for everything. With a final, thunderous crack, the altar shattered, sending a shockwave through the chamber that knocked Ren off his feet. The ground trembled beneath him, and the air was thick with the scent of burning bone, the stench of a power being torn apart. The spire of bone began to crumble, the creature's form shuddering as it began to dissipate, its grip on this world slipping away. But as the altar shattered, a final scream pierced the air, one that chilled Ren's very soul. The creature was not gone. It was still there, clawing at the edges of reality, and for a moment he wondered if they had done anything at all. And then the whispers stopped. Everything fell silent. Ren's pulse pounded in his ears as he staggered to his feet, the remnants of the altar's glow fading, leaving only the cold, suffocating silence. The labyrinth around them began to settle, the walls no longer shifting. But it wasn't over. Not yet. The thing had been stopped, for now, but something had changed. The bones, now scattered in ruins, still hummed with an ancient power, a power that refused to die. The air was thick with the remnants of the ritual, and Ren knew that this was not the end. It was only the beginning. The silence was deafening. It swallowed everything. The screams, the chaos, the frantic, desperate last moments of the men who had fallen to the creature's grasp. Ren stood amidst the ruins, his breath ragged, the hum of the shattered altar still ringing in his ears. The air felt thick, like it had been pressed down by the weight of what had transpired. The ground around him was littered with bone shards. The remains of the once massive spire, now reduced to a pile of shattered fragments that barely resembled the force that had risen so violently only moments before. But even in the stillness, Ren knew it wasn't over. He could feel it in his bones. There was something wrong, something he couldn't quite place. The light from the altar had faded, but the darkness hadn't fully receded. It lingered in the air like a stain, clinging to everything it touched. His mind raced, trying to process what had happened. They had destroyed the altar, the focal point of the ritual, and the creature had screamed, dissipating into the void. But the bones were still alive. He took a slow, cautious step forward, the ground beneath his boots slick with blood and ichor. The bodies of his men lay scattered across the chamber, some twisted in ways that defied the laws of nature, others simply gone, consumed by the creature's insatiable hunger. He wanted to look away, but he couldn't. The sight of their mangled forms, the terrible realization of how close they had come to succumbing to that dark power, it weighed on him. The guilt gnawed at him, sharper than any wound. "Commissar, sir." The voice, weak and hoarse, broke through the silence. Ren snapped his head toward the sound, his pulse quickening. It was one of the remaining soldiers, dragging himself toward him, his armor torn and scorched. His face was pale, his eyes wide with fear, but there was something else there, a flicker of recognition, of understanding. "Sergeant ... Ren said, his voice low, strained. "Are there any survivors?" The sergeant nodded, barely able to keep himself upright. "A few, sir, but we're too late. It's still here." His voice faltered, his words trailing off into a ragged cough. He gasped for air, his breath shallow. "The bones, they're still moving. Not like before, but they're alive. They're waiting." Ren's stomach twisted. He felt it then, the subtle shift in the air, the tension that still clung to the room. The bones hadn't stopped, they had merely paused, as though waiting for the next command, the next moment of weakness. "What do you mean, waiting?" Ren asked, stepping closer, his hand gripping the sergeant's arm. The sergeant's gaze shifted, his eyes wild, as though he were looking into something Ren couldn't see. They're part of it, sir," the sergeant rasped, his voice growing weaker. "The altar was just the beginning. The bones, they're a doorway. The thing, it's still here, but it's contained for now. The altar was its anchor. Now it's waiting for us to fall, waiting for the next move." Ren's heart pounded in his chest. The sergeant's words were like ice, freezing his very blood. They hadn't won. They hadn't stopped the creature. They had only delayed it. "Is there a way to—" The sergeant didn't answer. His head jerked back, eyes wide, his breath catching in his throat. Ren barely had time to react before the man's body convulsed, his limbs twitching violently as though some unseen force was gripping him. The sergeant's mouth opened wide in a silent scream, his body writhing in agony as the bones around them began to tremble once more. Ren's eyes widened in horror as the sergeant's body twisted unnaturally, his bones snapping and reshaping in grotesque patterns, his flesh contorting as if the very marrow inside him was being reformed, reshaped by some unholy power. His skin cracked, revealing bone beneath, and then with a sickening crack, the man's body was torn apart. The bones themselves leapt from the wreckage, crawling across the floor, their jagged edges scrapping against the stone like hungry claws. "No!" Ren shouted, his voice breaking through the madness. He raised his sword, charging at the crawling bones, but they scattered, reforming as they swarmed together, pulling themselves into an amalgamation of limbs, spines, and skulls. The creature was rebuilding itself. It was still alive, still clinging to this world, refusing to fade into the darkness. A low growl rumbled from the center of the mass of bones, and Ren froze. The growl was deep and resonant, not human, not even beastly. It was the sound of something ancient, something that had been lying dormant for untold millennia, waiting for this moment to come. And now it was stirring, waking from the prison they had unwittingly unlocked. The bones began to lift into the air, twisting into a towering form that was far more horrifying than anything Ren had seen before. It was not a man, not a beast. It was a thing, a massive structure of bone and sinew, pulsing with a terrible energy that sent a shockwave through the chamber. The altar's destruction had been nothing but a temporary setback. The true ritual was still unfolding, and this creature, this entity, was not about to be denied. Ren's pulse hammered in his ears as the creature loomed over him, its form shifting and writhing, its many skeletal limbs outstretched toward him like claws, grasping for him. The whispers returned, louder now, frantic, as if the bones themselves were speaking directly to him. "You cannot stop it. You cannot stop us. We are eternal." The ground shook again, this time with the force of an explosion, and Ren staggered backward. His mind raced. There was no time left, no escape, no more options. And then, in that moment, Ren knew what had to be done. He turned his gaze back to the chamber, to the twisted form of the creature that had been born from the bones. And he knew, with sickening clarity, that the only way to stop it, to stop them, was to destroy the entire labyrinth, to bring down the very foundation of this cursed place. Only then could the creature and its influence be banished forever. The thought nearly broke him, the weight of it pressing down on him like an iron bar. But there was no choice. They had unleashed this nightmare, and now they would pay the price. "Everyone, fall back!" Ren shouted, his voice booming across the chamber, commanding his men to move. But there was no place to retreat, no safe haven. They were trapped. The bones were rising, and Ren had to make his move before it was too late. Ren's mind raced, his thoughts tangled in a whirlwind of desperation and fear. The creature, now fully formed, loomed over them, a towering monstrosity, its skeletal body shifting like liquid bone, each movement impossibly fluid and unnatural. The tendrils of bone reached for him, claws scraping against the stone floor, while the walls of the chamber seemed to pulse in time with the creature's every movement. It was as though the entire labyrinth had come alive, feeding off the chaos and terror that swirled in the air. He could feel the heat from its form, an oppressive, smothering presence that threatened to suffocate him. The ground trembled beneath his boots, the earth itself vibrating with the energy that the creature radiated. The whispers in his mind had grown louder, more distinct, no longer just the background hum of the labyrinth's power. Now, the words were clear, insistent, pleading, commanding. "Do you hear it, Commissar?" One of the soldiers called out, his voice trembling. "The bones! They're alive! It's not just one thing, it's all of them!" Ren's eyes flicked toward the soldier, who was struggling to keep his footing as the bone creature's form shifted and coiled like a massive serpent. There were more of them. He could see them now. Fragments of bone, half-formed bodies, crawling toward the center of the chamber, feeding into the creature's mass. The bones of the dead, the remains of the fallen, had become part of something far greater. It was no longer just a cult. It was a hunger that devoured everything in its path, transforming everything it touched into part of its endless, twisted body. There was no fighting this, not with guns, not with swords. This was a war of souls, of flesh and bone, and Ren understood that despite everything, they had never stood a chance. And yet, there was still something in him that refused to surrender. "We can't win this battle," Ren muttered, more to himself than anyone else. His hand tightened around the hilt of his power sword, his knuckles white. "But we can destroy it. We can destroy it all." He turned sharply, glancing around at the remaining men, those few still capable of standing. Some had fallen to their knees, their eyes wide, staring at the creature in awe and terror. Others were trembling, sweat pouring down their faces, their hands shaking uncontrollably. The weight of the moment was too much for them. They were lost, broken by the sheer power of the thing that towered before them. But Ren could not afford to break. Not now. He had seen too much. Sacrifices had already been made, and there was no turning back. "We need to destroy the labyrinth," he commanded, his voice steady, despite the pounding of his heart in his chest. "Bring down the structure. Bring down the very bones. It's the only way." "How, sir?" the sergeant gasped, his voice strained. "The walls, they're moving. The bones, they're everywhere." Ren's eyes narrowed, his gaze shifting to the walls around them. He could feel it now, the subtle shift in the air, the pulse of energy flowing through the labyrinth's bones. It was a network, an unholy web of living matter that connected the entire structure. Every wall, every pillar, every floor tile was part of it. Destroying one part of the labyrinth was not enough. They needed to sever the whole network, to break the connection before it was too late. "We need to get to the heart of it," Ren said, his mind whirring as he formulated a plan, no matter how impossible it seemed. The altar may have been the source of the ritual, but the real power is in the bones themselves. If we can destroy the central mass, the core of the labyrinth, we can sever the creature's hold. We can stop it from feeding, from growing stronger. The soldiers looked at him, fear and disbelief in their eyes. But Ren had seen that look before. It was the same look that had crossed the faces of every man who had faced impossible odds. It was the look of men on the edge of destruction, who knew that the only way out was forward. They would follow him. They had to. Ren turned back toward the creature, his heart pounding in his chest. It was still towering above them, its form shifting in grotesque patterns, its many limbs reaching out toward the men. The whispers grew louder, the voice of the creature echoing in his mind like a deep, resonant hum. "Do you think you can stop us?" The creature's voice boomed, a low, guttural growl that vibrated through the very walls of the chamber. "You are nothing but a fleeting moment in time. You will be absorbed. You will be consumed." The words hit Ren like a physical blow, but he refused to let them shake him. He raised his sword, the energy crackling at its tip, and met the creature's gaze. "We will stop you," he declared, his voice cold with conviction. "We will end this, or we will die trying." With that, he turned and ran, his soldiers following close behind him. The bone creature let out a roar, a terrible sound that reverberated through the entire labyrinth, and the very walls seemed to tremble in response. Ren's pulse raced as they ran deeper into the heart of the labyrinth, the air growing thicker, colder with every step. They were close now. So close. The labyrinth was alive, and it was fighting back. But Ren's resolve burned brighter than ever. They would not let it win. They couldn't. Not after everything they had been through. The altar had been the spark, the bones the fuel, but the heart of this nightmare was still ahead. If they could reach it, if they could tear it down, they could stop the creature from fully emerging. It was their last chance. And it was time to make it count. The labyrinth groaned as Ren and his men pressed on, the walls shuddering with an unnatural rhythm, like the very bones of the structure were breathing. The pulse of the creature's power still throbbed in the air, vibrating through the stone and bone beneath their feet. The whispering had returned, louder now, more insistent, clawing at Ren's mind, urging him to stop, to give in. But there was no turning back. Each step felt like a battle against the darkness closing in around them. The walls seemed to lean in, pressing tighter as they moved, as if the labyrinth itself were alive, resisting their progress. The faint light from their torches barely pushed back the overwhelming darkness, and in the corners of Ren's vision, he thought he saw shapes moving, shifting fragments of bone, slithering in the periphery, watching, waiting. "Commissar, we're running out of time," the sergeant whispered urgently, his voice strained with exhaustion. "The walls, they're moving again. We won't make it if we don't—" "We will," Ren interrupted, his voice sharp. There was no room for doubt. He couldn't afford to let it seep in. Not now, not when they were so close. Keep moving. But as he spoke, he felt the weight of the labyrinth's power pressing down harder, each breath coming with increasing difficulty, as though the very air had thickened, become saturated with the creature's influence. The whispers were no longer subtle. They were screaming now, filling his mind with images of bone, of endless corridors, of faces, his men's faces, twisted and broken, becoming part of the creature. Ren fought to maintain control, but it was getting harder. The ground beneath him was vibrating more violently now, as though the bones themselves were shaking in anticipation. He felt the shift in the air, the pressure of the labyrinth's will against him. The creature wasn't just waiting, it was watching, it was feeding off their fear, and the closer they came to the heart of the labyrinth, the stronger it grew. The chamber they entered was larger than any they had passed through so far. The walls seemed to stretch up endlessly, vanishing into darkness far above. The floor was a sea of shattered bones, twisted and broken into grotesque shapes, and in the center of the chamber, the altar stood, no longer a mere structure, but a towering monument of bone, its form expanding upward like the roots of some monstrous tree. But this was no ordinary altar. This was the heart of the labyrinth, the place where the ritual had begun, where the creature had been anchored to this world. And it was alive. Ren could feel it in his bones, the pulse of its energy thrumming through the chamber, feeding into the labyrinth itself, drawing power from the very walls. The air here was thick with the stench of decay, a fetid odor that clung to everything, making it hard to breathe. And there, at the base of the altar, were the remains of the bone cultists, twisted, broken, their bodies fused with the bones of the labyrinth. They were not fully dead, not fully alive. They were something in between, their forms twisted and reformed by the ritual, their minds consumed by the creature's hunger. The creature was no longer hiding. It was emerging, its form stretching upward, pulling itself through the bones that had once held it in check. The walls of the chamber began to crack, splintering as the power within them surged. Ren's sword hummed in his grip, the energy crackling at its edge. But even as he raised it, he knew it wouldn't be enough. The creature was too powerful now. It was too far gone. "We have to destroy it," Ren said, his voice firm, but there was no conviction in his words. He could feel the weight of their failure hanging over him. The ritual had already been set in motion, and no amount of fire or steel could undo it now. But there was no choice. He had to try. "How do we stop this, sir?" the sergeant asked, his voice small, barely audible over the growing noise of the labyrinth's awakening. Ren didn't have an answer. His mind raced as he scanned the altar, looking for something, anything, that might give them a way to stop it. But the altar was a living thing, its very form shifting, pulsing with energy. The bones had become part of it, part of the creature, and every time they tried to strike it, it simply reformed, its power regenerating faster than they could tear it down. "We need to sever its connection," Ren said, the words coming to him like a fragment of a memory. "The altar, the bones, they're connected. We have to break the network, destroy the heart." But how? How could they destroy the heart of something so vast, so powerful, when every move they made only seemed to make it stronger? The sergeant nodded, his eyes dark with the weight of defeat. "And how do we do that, sir? How do we kill something that is already dead?" Ren opened his mouth to respond, but before he could speak, a low rumble filled the chamber. The ground trembled again, but this time it was different. It wasn't just the labyrinth shifting, it was the creature itself, pulling itself from the altar, from the bones that had once been its prison. It was breaking free, and there was no stopping it. The altar began to split open, the bones cracking, splintering like glass, and from the heart of the structure, something began to rise. A vast, writhing mass of bone, sinew, and darkness, pulling itself up from the depths of the labyrinth. It was not a man. It was not a beast. It was something far worse, something that had been waiting in the dark for millennia. And it was coming for them. Ren's heart slammed in his chest as he took a step back, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The creature towered above him now, its skeletal form shifting and bending in ways that defied nature. It was no longer a mere thing of bone. It had become something far worse, an entity, a force of nature that would consume everything in its path. The labyrinth had been its cage, but now it was free, and Ren knew, with sickening certainty, that there was no way to stop it, not unless they destroyed everything. There was no more time. Ren turned to his men, his voice low and filled with the weight of finality. "We end this, now." Ren's eyes never left the writhing mass of bones as it rose from the altar, its form twisting and reshaping, an abomination of sinew, bone, and malice. It was no longer a creature. It was a force, something that had been bound for millennia, and was now free to devour everything in its path. The whispering had become a roar, crashing through his mind like a tidal wave, clawing at his thoughts, filling him with the overwhelming urge to join it, to become one with it. It wasn't just a physical presence. It was in his mind, in his soul, and it sought to consume everything he was. His breath came in sharp gasps as he took a step back, the weight of the moment pressing down on him. There was no room for fear now. There was only the task before him. This thing, this creature, could not be allowed to live. Not now that it had emerged. Not now that it had broken free. The walls of the labyrinth trembled as the bones around them began to rise, forming pillars, walls, and jagged spires, each one twisting toward the central mass like some horrific web. The ground beneath them cracked open, splitting apart as if the very earth was being devoured by the creature's presence. The sound was deafening, the grinding of bone against bone, the pulse of the creature's heartbeat reverberating through the chamber. "Commissar, we need to move!" the sergeant shouted, his voice raw with fear. But Ren could feel it now, the pull, the weight of the creature's influence, and for a brief moment, even he hesitated. It was calling to him, just as it had called to his men. It wanted him to surrender, to fall into its embrace. But he couldn't. Not now. Not after everything they had been through. Ren turned to the men who remained, his voice cutting through the chaos. "We end this," he said, the words grim but resolute. "We destroy it. We destroy everything." He didn't know how, but he knew they had no choice. The creature was growing stronger with each passing second, and if they didn't act now, there would be no stopping it. "Form up," he barked. "We're going to the center." The soldiers, shaky but determined, fell into line behind him, their weapons raised. But Ren knew that weapons would not be enough. The bones, the very labyrinth itself, were part of the creature now. Every step they took, every shot fired, seemed to strengthen its hold on reality. It wasn't just an enemy they were facing, it was an infection, a corruption that was spreading through the very fabric of the world. They pushed forward, their boots crunching against the scattered bones that littered the chamber. Every movement, every breath, seemed to draw the creature's attention closer, as if the labyrinth was alive, watching them. Ren's eyes scanned the altar, looking for anything that could help them destroy the creature's hold. The sigils carved into the stone were glowing brighter now, pulsating with the creature's heartbeat. They were the key. He had to destroy them. But as he approached the altar, the creature's voice boomed in his mind, cold and cruel. "You cannot destroy me. I am eternal. You will become part of me, just as your men have." The words rattled through his mind, sinking deep into his consciousness. Ren's head swam with dizziness as the creature's power surged within the chamber. He could feel his bones creaking, his joints aching, as if the very marrow in his body was being pulled toward the altar. "Focus!" Ren snapped, shaking off the creature's influence. He could feel his grip slipping, the power of the creature threatening to break him, to shatter his resolve. But he wouldn't let it. He couldn't. The soldiers pressed forward, each step harder than the last, but they were with him. They were fighting with him, even if they couldn't see the full extent of what they were up against. Their lives had been shaped by the Imperium, their very souls bound to the Emperor's will, and now, in this moment of darkness, they had to find that strength again. They had to believe. Ren reached the altar and slammed his sword into the stone, his blade humming with power as it met the glowing sigils. The stone cracked under the force of the blow, but it didn't break. The sigils flared, their light blinding, their energy pushing back against him. The creature roared, a sound like thunder, shaking the chamber. Ren's vision blurred as the ground beneath him cracked open, the bones of the labyrinth shifting, reforming into new, twisted shapes. The creature was reacting, fighting back. With a desperate cry, Ren swung his sword again, the power surging through him as he focused everything on the altar. The sigils had to be destroyed. They were the last link, the anchor that held the creature in this world. If they could break it, They could break the creature. But the altar was fighting back. The bones trembled, and the ground itself began to pull at them, as if it were trying to swallow them whole. The air thickened, suffocating, and Ren's breath caught in his throat as the power of the creature surged once more, pulling at his very soul. "You cannot defeat me," the creature whispered again, its voice soft but overwhelming. "For I am eternal, and you are nothing." Ren's mind reeled, but there was one thing he knew beyond any doubt. They had to believe. They had to fight. "For the Emperor!" Ren screamed, and with every ounce of his strength, he plunged his sword into the heart of the altar, shattering the sigils with a blinding burst of light. The ground shook violently as the creature's roar echoed through the labyrinth, its form thrashing against the stone, its power surging with an intensity Ren could barely comprehend. But this time, it was different. The bones beneath them cracked, splintered, and with a final bone-shattering scream, the creature's power began to wane, its form disintegrating before their eyes. The labyrinth trembled once more, the bones shifting, groaning as the darkness began to recede. Ren could feel the weight lifting from his chest, the oppressive presence of the creature fading into nothingness. The air, once thick with the stench of death, began to clear. The nightmare was over, for now. The collapse of the creature's form echoed through the chamber, a thunderous crack that reverberated in Ren's bones. The air, thick and suffocating moments before, suddenly grew still, as if the very atmosphere had exhaled in relief. But even as the vibrations from the final scream of the beast faded, Ren knew this was not over. Not yet. His sword hummed quietly in his grip, its energy flickering out like a dying star. The ground beneath him, once trembling with the force of the creature's presence, had stilled. Yet, in the silence, Ren could still hear the faint scraping sound of bones shifting, of something alive beneath the surface. The labyrinth was not dead. It was only waiting. "Is it over?" The sergeant's voice was barely a whisper, his eyes locked on the remnants of the altar, which was now little more than a pile of cracked stone and charred bone. His hands were trembling, not from fear, but from exhaustion, from the weight of what they had just witnessed. Ren didn't answer immediately. His gaze was fixed on the altar's ruin, the air still thick with the remnants of the creature's power. The labyrinth had been alive, pulsing, feeding. And even now, as the bones lay shattered around them, Ren could feel it. The faint hum of something ancient, something that refused to die. He could sense the very walls of the labyrinth, shuddering beneath the weight of this dark power, as though it was trying to heal, to regrow itself. But there was no time to dwell on it. They had survived. Barely. They had won for now. And that was all that mattered. Ren turned away from the altar, his voice a low growl. "Keep moving. We need to get out of here before this place swallows us whole." The remaining soldiers, pale and exhausted, nodded without speaking, instinctively forming a loose circle around Ren. They moved cautiously through the chamber, eyes scanning the walls and floors, aware that the labyrinth was not done with them. It had not given up. It was merely waiting for another opportunity to strike, to consume them as it had consumed so many before. Ren's mind raced as they made their way through the crumbling tunnels. The weight of what they had just done, the destruction of the altar, the breaking of the ritual, was settling on him like a stone pressing against his chest. They had destroyed the connection. They had severed the creature's grasp on this reality. But had they truly stopped it? Or had they simply delayed its inevitable return? The thought gnawed at him, and he found himself looking over his shoulder, half expecting the bones to rise again, to reform into something even more monstrous. He could feel it in the air, the lingering threat. The labyrinth was not just a physical structure. It was a force, a living entity tied to something far older, something beyond the comprehension of mortal minds. They had been foolish to think they could destroy it so easily, but they had done it. They had broken it, for now. The walls around them seemed to pulse with every step, the corridors narrowing, the shadows creeping closer. The very bones of the labyrinth had started to regrow, to shift and reconfigure, as though the place had an intelligence, a malevolent will of its own. They were not safe, not yet. The walls were closing in. A low rumble filled the air, like the groaning of the labyrinth itself. The ground beneath them shifted again, and Ren's pulse quickened. "Move faster!" he ordered, urgency flooding his voice. The men quickened their pace, their footfalls echoing in the now deafening silence. Then, just as quickly as the rumbling had begun, it stopped. Ren turned sharply, his eyes scanning the surroundings. The walls had stopped moving, the tremors had ceased, but there was something else, a feeling, an emptiness that clung to the space around them, a coldness that settled deep in his bones. The creature had been banished, the labyrinth had been disrupted, its power fractured, but it had not been destroyed. The oppressive weight of the place seemed to lift slightly, but it was still there. A malignant presence, waiting, watching, like a predator that had retreated into the shadows to regroup. Ren could feel it in the pit of his stomach. This was not over, not by a long shot. They continued through the winding halls, the silence around them growing more profound with each step. The sense of something watching, waiting, never fully dissipated. They had to get out, they had to escape. After what felt like hours, the faintest sliver of light began to break through the oppressive darkness ahead. A distant exit, a crack in the labyrinth's unyielding structure. Hope. The sergeant, still by Ren's side, was the first to break the silence. Do you think the Emperor's light will ever reach this place again?" His voice was quiet, fragile. Ren didn't answer immediately. There was no answer to that question. Not yet. He simply looked ahead, his gaze fixed on the narrow sliver of light, and said, "We'll make sure. It does." The path ahead was uncertain, the labyrinth still an ever-present looming threat. But Ren knew one thing. They had made it this far. They had survived the impossible, and they would continue to fight, even if the battle had only just begun. The light ahead grew brighter with each step, but Ren's heart was heavy with the uncertainty of what lay beyond. The walls around them, once so oppressive and alive with the creature's malevolent presence, now felt distant, like a memory they were walking away from. The path ahead seemed to be opening, as if the labyrinth, or whatever was left of it, was reluctantly conceding to their will. Yet Ren could feel it, a lingering presence, a faint pulse that echoed in his bones, like the aftershock of a storm still rippling through the air. The men were quiet, their steps faltering as they drew closer to the exit, their faces etched with exhaustion and fear. The death of the creature, or whatever it had truly been, hadn't freed them. They were still bound by the echoes of its influence. The whispering had stopped, but something still hung in the air, something unresolved. It wasn't just the labyrinth they had fought through. It was the memory of it, the sense that this place could never be erased. The light grew brighter, finally cutting through the last stretch of darkness that had clung to the labyrinth like a shroud. Ren's heart rate quickened as the outline of an exit emerged ahead. There was a door, no, a passage, an archway of broken stone that had once been part of some long-forgotten structure. Beyond it was a sliver of daylight, a world that seemed distant, unreal after everything they had endured. He could almost taste it, the air, fresh and clean, untainted by the stench of decay. For a moment, it felt like a dream. They had made it out. They had survived. But as he approached the doorway, something stopped him. A flicker in the air, a subtle distortion of light. His breath caught in his throat, and the others halted behind him, sensing it too. A low hum vibrated through the ground beneath them, not the rumble of the labyrinth, but something else. Something deeper, more primal. It wasn't over. The labyrinth, the creature, it had left a mark, and now it was waiting. "Commissar!" The sergeant's voice was barely above a whisper. "What's happening?" Ren's eyes narrowed. He could feel it, a shift, a pull in the air that made every fibre of his being scream to turn back. But there was no turning back. The labyrinth had already begun to change them. They couldn't allow it to take them again. The hum grew louder, and then the ground beneath their feet shuddered. The air was suddenly thick again, stifling, as though the light from the exit was being consumed by the very shadows they had fought through. The bones beneath the earth stirred, but it wasn't the creature they had fought. This was different. This was something older, something tied to the land itself. "No," Ren muttered, the realization dawning on him. Not again. The archway before them flickered as though it were a mirage. The sunlight beyond it faded, replaced by a sickly greenish glow that emanated from the cracks in the stone. The air grew colder again, and the bones scattered on the ground began to move. Slowly at first, then faster, shifting, rising from the earth like fragments of some twisted puzzle, pulling themselves together. Ren felt his stomach churn as he saw the skeletal forms begin to reform, each piece of bone snapping back into place with unnatural precision, becoming something new, something even more horrific than before. One by one, the men around him stiffened, their eyes wide in terror as the walls of the labyrinth began to reshape themselves, reforming into new, twisted shapes. The passage they had walked through was narrowing, the archway shifting back into the bone-ridden walls, closing them in once more. It was as if the labyrinth had never truly let them go. It had always been waiting, and now it was ready to reclaim them. "Move! Move!" Ren shouted, his voice hoarse with urgency. He turned on his heel and sprinted toward the forming bones, his men scrambling behind him. The archway, the passage to freedom, was now blocked. The labyrinth had sealed them in once again. The walls trembled as the bones reformed into massive spires, towers of bone that loomed overhead. The creature, or what was left of it, had not died. It had been reborn. The labyrinth itself had consumed the remnants, taken the fragments of its power, and now it was awakening, more dangerous than ever. Ren's pulse raced as they ran through the ever-changing labyrinth, their footsteps echoing through the empty corridors. There was no place to hide. There was no way out. But as they ran, the sound of something else reached his ears, a low, rhythmic thudding, like a heartbeat that reverberated through the very walls. The ground shuddered beneath their feet again, and Ren realized with a jolt that it wasn't just the labyrinth. It was something else, something beneath them. "The heart," he whispered, his breath catching in his throat. The heart of the labyrinth. It wasn't just the bones. The labyrinth wasn't just an entity. It was a living, breathing thing, a system, a network, a massive organism that had fed on them, on their fear, on the death of their comrades. It had become something more than just a prison. It was a parasite, feeding on everything around it, consuming, evolving. "We have to destroy the heart," Ren said, his voice low and filled with grim determination. "If we don't, it will never end. It will keep coming for us, for everyone." The soldiers around him looked to him with wide eyes, but they didn't question him. They had been through too much. They had already made their choice. They would die in the dark, or they would end it. Ren didn't hesitate. He pushed forward, his sword raised, his mind focused on one thing: the heart of the labyrinth. He didn't know how to destroy it, but he knew that if they failed, everything they had fought for, everything they had sacrificed, would be for nothing. The final battle was ahead. The heart would either be destroyed, or they would all perish together. Ren's sword felt heavier with each step, as if the weight of the labyrinth was pulling at him, trying to drag him back into its depths. The bones had already begun to reform, the walls of the corridor twisting and buckling as the labyrinth shifted. The heartbeat of the creature beneath them pulsed through the stone floor like the rhythm of a living organism, alive with hunger, alive with malice. Ren could hear it, the sound of something ancient and terrible stirring beneath the earth, feeding on the bones, feeding on them, The men were still with him, their faces pale, their eyes wide with terror. But they followed, driven by the single, unrelenting need to survive. They had made it this far. They would make it farther, or they would die trying. There was no turning back now. They moved quickly through the maze of bone and stone, Ren leading them, his mind racing with the need to find the heart of the labyrinth. It was the only way. Destroying the altar had only broken the connection, but it hadn't severed the labyrinth's core. The creature, the force that had taken root in this place, still pulsed with power, its very essence embedded in the bones that wove through every passage, every corner. It was a system, a network, and the only way to destroy it was to sever the heart, to rip it from the labyrinth's chest. The air around them grew colder, and the shadows deepened, pressing in on all sides. Ren could feel the change. Something was watching them, something older than anything he could have imagined. It was as if the labyrinth itself had a mind, and that mind was fixated on them. They were its prey. His breath came in sharp gasps, his steps quickening as the path narrowed. The walls seemed to close in, their jagged surfaces pressing together like teeth about to snap shut. He could feel the oppressive weight of the labyrinth's power, its hunger, growing stronger with each passing second. They were running out of time. And then, ahead of them, he saw it. The heart of the labyrinth. It was not a single object, not something tangible. Number. The heart was the very center of this place, the nexus that connected every bone, every sinew of the structure. The walls, the ceiling, the very floor, all of it was alive, pulsing with energy. But at the center, at the core, there was something else. A pulsing mass of bone encased in a cocoon of writhing tendrils that seemed to stretch out to every corner of the labyrinth, feeding on its own power. The heart was not just the source of the labyrinth's strength. It was the anchor of the creature that had risen from the depths. And as Ren looked at it, he knew this was where the final battle would take place. This was the last bastion of the creature's power, the last barrier between them and survival. But there was something else, something wrong. The pulsing mass at the heart of the labyrinth was not just alive, it was aware. Ren could feel it, like a presence in his mind, a cold, invasive force that pressed against the edges of his thoughts. It was as if the labyrinth had become the creature, and the creature had become the labyrinth. A low growl rumbled from the heart, the very bones vibrating with it, and Ren's heart skipped a beat. The air shifted, thickening, and he saw it. A figure standing at the edge of the heart, cloaked in shadow. A figure that shouldn't have been there. The figure turned toward them, and Ren froze. It was the cultist, the same one who had led them here, the one whose broken words had hinted at the terrible truth of the labyrinth. His eyes glowed with an unnatural light, his body twisted and broken, his skin pulled tight over his bones like a macabre mockery of life. He stood at the center of the heart, the tendrils of bone curling around him like protective arms. And then the cultist spoke. "You think you've won," he said, his voice a hollow, echoing whisper. "You think you've destroyed it, but you've only set it free." Ren's grip on his sword tightened, his blood running cold. The cultist's form shimmered, flickering as though he were not entirely real, a figment of the labyrinth's power. His eyes locked onto Ren, and the creature's voice filled his mind again, louder now, commanding, invading. "You are nothing. You cannot destroy what is eternal." Ren gritted his teeth, the weight of the creature's presence pressing on him like a physical force. He fought to keep his thoughts clear, to hold on to the one thing that had kept him going through this nightmare. His will. "No," Ren muttered, shaking his head. "We won't let you win." The cultist's lips curled into a twisted smile, his body trembling as if it were on the edge of dissolving into bone and shadow. "You have no choice," he whispered. "The labyrinth will consume you all." With that, the cultist's body began to disintegrate, his flesh turning to dust as the bones of the labyrinth began to stir. The walls shook violently as the tendrils of bone twisted and reformed, the labyrinth growing, shifting in response to the collapse of its anchor. The air around them thickened with the sound of cracking bone, of grinding, reshaping structures. The labyrinth was alive, and it was fighting back. Ren turned to his men, his voice rising above the chaos. "We end this now!" He charged forward, his sword raised high, and the men followed, driven by the same determination that had brought them this far. They were running out of time. The labyrinth was collapsing, the creature was growing stronger, and the heart of the labyrinth, the source of its power, was their final target. Ren had no illusions. They were walking into the heart of darkness, and there would be no escape unless they succeeded. The final battle was at hand. The sound of bones grinding filled the air, deafening, as the labyrinth began to collapse in on itself. Ren's heart pounded in his chest, but there was no hesitation. They had reached the center, the heart of the creature's power, and now there was only one option left. The labyrinth was alive, thrumming with dark energy, and it wanted them dead. But he wouldn't let it win. He couldn't. "Move!" Ren barked, his voice cutting through the chaos, spurring the men forward. The bones shifted beneath their feet, jagged and sharp, threatening to tear through their boots, but they pressed on. Each step was harder than the last, the weight of the labyrinth pressing down on them like an invisible force. The air was thick with the stench of death and decay, the once oppressive pulse of the creature's presence now twisted into something darker, more malignant. It was as though the very walls of the labyrinth were turning against them, reshaping themselves to trap them in an endless maze. Every turn they made seemed to lead to another dead end, another mass of bones rising to block their path. But Ren had seen this before. He had fought through worse, and now the labyrinth was no longer just a maze of corridors. It was a battleground, a living, breathing entity that would stop at nothing to claim them. They had to keep moving. They had to reach the core before it was too late. As they neared the center, Ren could feel the vibrations in the ground growing stronger, each beat like the heartbeat of a giant, a creature that could not be stopped. And then, at the very heart of the labyrinth, he saw it. The massive structure, a column of bone and sinew, rose before them, pulsing with a sickly green glow. The tendrils that snaked from its base seemed to reach for them, as if the creature were alive, feeding on the very air, on their fear, their presence. The altar, shattered now, had been only the first step. This was the true heart, the core that had been feeding the labyrinth's insatiable hunger. It was here, the source of the nightmare. The men around Ren slowed, their faces pale with exhaustion, but their resolve hardened. They had no choice. This was their last chance, and they would not back down now. Ren raised his sword, the energy flickering at its edge, and stepped forward, his voice steady, but filled with the weight of their mission. "We finish this." As they moved toward the heart of the labyrinth, the walls around them began to tremble. The floor cracked, and the air thickened, suffocating, as though the very atmosphere was being drawn into the creature's body. Ren could hear it, feel it, a deep, pulsing energy that was growing stronger with each step they took. And then, the ground beneath them gave way. The floor shattered, sending Ren and his men tumbling into a massive, cavernous pit that seemed to stretch endlessly below them. The air rushed past them as they fell, their screams swallowed by the blackness. The walls of bone closed in above them, and the creature's pulse grew louder, filling their minds with the terrible, insistent beat of its power. Just as they thought the fall would never end, their bodies slammed into the cold, jagged ground. Ren gasped for breath, his vision blurred, but his grip on his sword never wavered. His men struggled to their feet, some dazed, others more broken than before, but they stood together, their eyes filled with fear and determination. They were in the heart of the labyrinth now. The air around them was colder than before, thick with the same oppressive darkness that had consumed the maze. The bones had formed into massive spires, twisting around them like pillars of death. The ground beneath their feet was slick with something that smelled like decay, and the pulsating light from the heart of the labyrinth cast long shadows that seemed to stretch toward them like reaching hands. Ren scanned the surroundings, his mind calculating, but his pulse racing. This was it. The creature was at its full strength, and it was waiting for them. Its power surged through the labyrinth like a living thing, and they were at the center of it, trapped in the very core of its existence. There was no room for mistakes now. Ren turned to his men, his voice low but commanding. "We end this. We destroy the core, and we destroy it all." But even as he spoke, he knew the truth. The core of the labyrinth, the heart that beat with the pulse of the creature, was not just a physical entity. It was part of something far greater. This was a part of the universe, a fragment of the warp that had become tangible, made real in the form of bones, blood, and death. To destroy it would mean more than just slaying a creature. It would mean breaking something that could not be rebuilt, but they had no choice. They moved forward, weapons drawn, toward the center of the labyrinth, where the heart pulsed with raw, unbridled power. The walls seemed to close in as they approached, the bones shifting like a massive living organism, hungry, waiting. The heart of the labyrinth throbbed, its rhythm matching the beating of their own hearts, echoing in the very marrow of their bones. Ren gritted his teeth as he stepped forward, his grip tightening on his sword. The moment of truth had arrived. They would either break the labyrinth's heart or be consumed by it. With a final cry, Ren charged, leading the men toward the heart of the labyrinth, toward the end. And as he struck, the walls collapsed around them. Ren's sword struck the heart with a resounding crack, the power of the blade sending a shockwave through the labyrinth. For a brief moment, time seemed to stop. There was no movement, no sound. The air hung in a thick, unnatural silence, and Ren felt the weight of the world pressing down on him, his heart pounding in his chest. The light from the core flickered, then flared brighter, blinding him for a split second. It was as though the heart itself was responding to the strike, reacting to the intrusion, to the destruction. Then, the world seemed to break. The walls of bone began to tremble violently, the ground buckling beneath them as though the entire labyrinth was waking, shifting, trying to resist the blow. The heart's pulsing light grew brighter, more violent, its energy surging through the air like an electrical storm. Ren staggered back, his vision blurring as the power of the labyrinth recoiled and snapped back against them. It was as if the heart was alive, fighting back against its inevitable destruction. The earth trembled, cracks snaking through the stone and bone beneath their feet. The air grew thick with a pressure so suffocating it felt as though they were being crushed from all sides. The light from the heart blazed so brightly now that it burned their retinas, but there was no turning away. They were committed. They had no choice but to see this through. "Move!" Ren shouted, but even as he spoke, the ground beneath them opened up, as though the very fabric of the labyrinth was tearing apart. Bones erupted from the floor, rising like twisted spires, their jagged edges sharp and unforgiving. Tendrils of bone lashed out, whipping through the air with terrifying speed, reaching for them, pulling, grasping. They were being pulled into the labyrinth's very core. It was as if the entire structure had come alive, its hunger unsatisfied, its rage unquenchable. "Commissar, we can't hold it!" the sergeant cried, struggling against the bones that seemed to writhe and pull at him, wrapping around his legs, dragging him toward the pulsing core. But Ren couldn't stop. He couldn't afford to falter. The creature's power was nearly spent, but the labyrinth itself was not defeated. It was fighting, struggling to hold on to whatever little of itself remained. "We end this now!" Ren yelled, turning to the sergeant, with a grim look of resolve in his eyes. He raised his sword once more, his grip tightening around the hilt, as the light of the heart pulsed in time with his own heartbeats. Every fibre of his being screamed to retreat, to save himself, but he refused. They had already sacrificed too much. They had already lost too much. With a final surge of energy, Ren charged forward, slashing through the bone tendrils that lashed at him. The air hummed with power, vibrating through the very ground as the heart began to crack, its surface splintering like glass, the energy within it buckling under the force of Ren's strike. He felt a surge of hope. The labyrinth was weakening. But just as quickly, that hope was shattered. The heart, now visibly cracking, fought back. The bone tendrils writhed in the air, now in a frenzy, snaking toward Ren, his men, anything that moved. The labyrinth wasn't just a structure. It was a mind, a malignant consciousness, and it wasn't going to let them escape without a price. Then, in an instant, the core exploded. The entire chamber lit up with a blinding flash of light, the explosion of energy tearing through the labyrinth. Ren was thrown back, his body slamming into the ground as the shockwave blasted through him. The roar of the blast filled his ears, drowning out everything else. The world spun, darkness closing in around him, but through the haze of pain and disorientation, Ren could hear it, the sound of bones cracking, the sound of the labyrinth dying. The walls shuddered again, more violently this time. The pulse of energy that had once filled the labyrinth with life began to slow, its heartbeat erratic, then still. The labyrinth was dying. The heart was gone. Ren struggled to rise, his body aching, his mind reeling from the blast. He glanced around, his vision swimming, and saw his men slowly pushing themselves up, their faces stained with blood and dirt, their eyes filled with a grim sense of determination. "We did it," the sergeant said hoarsely, his voice ragged but relieved. "It's over." Ren didn't respond immediately. He could feel the weight of the victory settling over him, but it was tempered with something else, a creeping sense of unease. The labyrinth was dying, but was it truly over, or had they simply won a temporary reprieve? The darkness of the creature, the influence of the labyrinth, still lingered in the air, like the echo of a terrible storm that had passed, but left the world broken in its wake. For a moment, Ren stood in the center of the wreckage, the pulsing light of the heart fading behind him. The bones of the labyrinth were still, the walls no longer trembled, the voices had stopped. But in their place, there was only silence. A silence that rang louder than any noise, louder than the roar of the creature or the crash of the collapsing labyrinth. "We've won," Ren whispered, but it felt hollow. The world had shifted. The labyrinth was broken, but in its destruction, it had left something behind, something they couldn't yet understand. The silence stretched, and Ren knew one thing with cold certainty. The war was over, but the battle for survival had only just begun.